Welcome to the Contractors Edge, the show where we break down the strategies, tactics, and tools that you need to grow your home service business. Whether you're in a truck or at the office, we're here to give you the edge that you need to win. I'm Mike Stiers.
I'm Anthony Brown.
Today's episode is all about what might be one of the most important topics you'll face as a business owner. What happens when it's time to sell your company? Private equity, consolidation, mergers and acquisitions, they're all over the headlines in the home service world right now. But what does that really mean for you? How do you prepare? And how do you avoid getting burned? To help us answer those questions, we've got a very special guest. Our guest today is Christian Olson, director at Footprint Capital. Christian brings over 15 years of diverse experience in both M&A and operations. Before joining Footprint, he managed a $100 million global division at Ashland Inc., along with M&A, capital investments, and projects across their global $15 billion portfolio of special chemical assets. He also worked in corporate development role at Pacer International, where he evaluated investments and acquisitions in the logistics industry. At Footprint, Christian's responsible for leading deal execution and business development, including dozens of transactions in the home service space, from plumbing and HVAC to foundation repair and waterproofing. Footprint Capital also advised on the sale of the Basement Doctor and Nash Distribution, so he knows this world inside and out. What makes Christian's perspective unique is that he's not just a deal maker. He grew up around the trades. His grandfather was a union welder and pipe fitter who helped build landmarks like Southdale Mall and the Metrodome. Today, Christian brings the same respect for the trades to the work that he does with contractors who are looking to grow, bring on investors, or eventually exit their business. Christian, welcome to the Contractors Edge.
Yes, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Anthony. Glad to be here. There's obviously lots to talk about as we're kind of a little bit beyond some of the tariff noise that impacted things kind of at the beginning of the year, and now people are returning from their summer vacations, school starting, and so I think deals are going to start to happen rapidly and start to accelerate. I think we're seeing a lot of activity on our side. And I would imagine, all the listeners out there are seeing a lot of activity on their side as well. So
yeah, it was one thing that I see people talking about. I watch the news and I keep up with what the sentiment is feeling like. And from what I'm hearing, people are like, you have to make a decision eventually. And so now people are coming to that. It's like, if I was holding on to my dollars, I can't do it for forever. So if this is what the landscape is going to be, if this is what the nature is going to be, we've got to make decisions based on that, right?
Yep.
So I want to jump right into things.
Sure.
So Christian, a lot of contractors hear private equity, and I think it means losing control or their people getting fired. What's the reality?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And quite honestly, we hear that quite a bit as well from some of our clients, believe it or not, is what you see, what's published kind of in private equity is the big deals, right? That are, Wall Street and, this publicly traded company buying this publicly traded company, SPACs, there's just a whole bunch of terms kind of floating out there. But, in reality, in the world that we deal with, which are what we call lower middle market companies with revenue somewhere between like 5 to 100 million, 150 million. That would be, we're dealing with families, we're dealing with owners, we're dealing with, kind of management teams and other kind of individuals that this is their first time, kind of going through this and thinking about a sale. And we call that, first institutional capital investment. So this is different than, your senior line of credit and your banking relationship. But yeah, private equity does have a lot of different flavors. And I think, to kind of break that down, what traditional private equity is, a group of individuals that have a track record of investing and growing companies and generating a return. They'll go out and they'll raise committed capital from institutions like pension funds, banks, wealthy family offices, and other types of institutional, insurance companies. Like obviously we're all in Columbus here, Nationwide Insurance. People think of them as Nationwide is on your side. Well, the other side of it is they have a whole entire investment arm that has 80% in public equities. They've got 10% in real estate, and then 10% in like alternative investments, and a sliver of that is in private equity investments. And so they're giving money to investors that go out and they basically are looking for deals in the lower middle market to build, to basically kind of take that next step, say, hey, got a great business over here. This guy's got a great idea. He's onto something. We're going to go and we're going to invest in his business and help him grow and then we're going to maybe buy and consolidate and put a bunch of companies together to ultimately create more value. And it's kind of like the whole like the little fish in the big pond or big fish in the little pond, but
Right.
the minnow to the sunfish to eventually gets up to the the northern pike or the muskie or that type of analogy. So that's kind of the game and the world that we live in from that perspective.
So do you think in a sense, private equity can get a bad rap through like some generalization. From what you were saying just now, there is kind of different identities around private equity. Maybe not all of them act in the same ways or focus on the same industries.
Yep, absolutely, and you're absolutely correct. So a kind of I would say traditional private equity, where where I was going is they get committed capital and then they go out and invest and typically have like a 3 to 5 year time horizon for their
Hmm.
investments. So they'll make one initial investment, call it which is kind of called a platform, which is the first investment kind of in that specific space or industry where they'll basically invest in that platform and then they'll use that as the vehicle to go out and acquire other like type of businesses and kind of put them together to grow earnings and revenue and to scale the business. Inside of kind of the traditional private equity, there's also a handful of groups out there, what we call like independent sponsors. So they have access to capital through their networks and their relationships, and
Hmm.
they basically raise capital on a deal by deal basis. So,
Okay.
they like a space, they know kind of their capital providers have invested with them or have a relationship with them. And, they'll go out, find the deal, get it under LOI, and then as part of that transaction, they'll put and raise that capital that goes into the deal to buy that initial investment. So that's kind of independent sponsors. And then you have another group called family offices, which are high net worth individuals that typically will sliver out and kind of carve out, some of their family's net worth and invest directly in companies to help them grow and scale. And the difference is like family offices they could buy and hold. I mean, obviously the biggest family
Hmm.
office out there is Berkshire Hathaway,
Right.
with Warren Buffett. And then you have a whole bunch of other different types of family offices. Well, they'll just buy, hold. They have, they can hold for 5 to 10 years. They don't have the restrictions to return capital back to the investors to deliver that type of a return. So, when people say private equity, there's a lot of different flavors of it. And I would say the biggest kind of misnomer is that in our space that we operate and all your audience operates is like they're investing in the people and the processes and the services that basically like are ready for that next level.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Okay. One thing that often comes up when I'm having these conversations, we have a lot of experience with different contractor or home service businesses at different sizes, and one of the questions, obviously, in the life cycle of a business is when to consider selling. Is it a revenue target that we're looking at? Is it how much time you spent in the business? Is it what your age is as the business owner? When should an owner start to think about an exit strategy?
Well, so that's kind of a loaded question because, kind of my background, kind of where I'm coming from in my career, I have just obviously been through a lot of transactions and kind of know the space. And so if I were to sit down and kind of start a business, from day one, I'm planning with the end in mind. And that's how I'm kind of, doing my strategy, my service offering, building out my business. And I'm always thinking about what am I really trying to do here? And if the answer is I don't know, it's just you're at the end of the day, you're in a job, right? So the ideal scenario is to like, think about that from a planning perspective and say, hey, is it 1 to 2 years? Is it 3 to 5? And then the other kind of thing that goes back with it is, just really, and I had a professor when I was doing my business school is like, at the end of the day, you just got to kind of take a step back and kind of look in the mirror and be like, hey, you know, what am I good at? And then, where do I need help? And if the answer is like, hey, I've grown my business successfully and I'm at $5 million, but man, it's really hard to like kind of clip that next level, going from 5 to 10, there are other people out there, and partners that you can start to, kind of, work with that will help, guide you through that from $5 to $10 million, right? Because those are big steps. I mean, growing from 0 to 1, I mean, that's typically what we call, and Mike knows this term, chucking a truck, right? Like,
Yep.
hey, we're going out, we're doing a good job, yeah, I'm making, maybe 250, $500,000, but key man risk, right? Like if something happens to me and I can't work, well, where does that business go? And so,
Mhm.
those are the different levels that we see, and it's pretty easy to go. And I shouldn't say this because I haven't done it, but to go from 0 to a million to 5 million, 5 to 10 becomes a lot harder and requires a lot of different skill sets. And then obviously, 10 million to 20, that's a whole different skill set. And then kind of taking it beyond, is even more difficult, right? And so, not a lot of entrepreneurs or business owners, have all those skills to do that. And so it really kind of requires like, hey, take a look in the mirror and say, hey, what do I want to do when I grow up, type of a thing. And I think that, the bigger thing too is that, there's a lot of terminology kind of thrown around about, hey, when I sell my business, I get a broker and they go and like, we just sell it. Well, that's a big difference. There's a big difference between what I would consider a traditional broker and an investment banker like our group. I mean, we're going to be, our group wants to come in right away early on in the process, do all the analysis up front, and then we're going to help work with you to be like, all right, well, what maybe needs to be done to the business before we take it to market? We're going to make sure that all the boxes are checked so that when we go to market, we're basically, you really only get like one really good shot at this thing. And so we want to put our best foot forward and we want to make sure it's right. And so, and not have to come back around because the last thing you want to do is get to the table. Like there's some questions coming up where, what happens if the deal's broken or something goes bad? Well, it's not preparing for that exit. So having an investment banker that, knows the business, knows the industry, knows what good looks like, knows the language that the investors and the buyer pool is going to bring to the table, really helps. And, in our business, from our perspective, everything we tell kind of clients and prospects is like, we've never like, we've always kind of cost justified our services in
Hmm.
every single deal. So we pay for ourselves like, more than, multiple times over.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know, Ron had actually shared a lot with me, and I worked hand in hand with
Yeah.
Betsy because she obviously did a lot of the really heavy lifting and communication, with your team. You guys were really an asset in that process. So, you know, obviously kudos to your team, which obviously made me like, I'm like, Anthony, we've
Yeah.
got to have Christian on.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
taking that because you're really kind of leading up to this point of almost like preparation, so
Yep.
many of our listeners, they're in the late 40s, early 50s, maybe 5 to 10 years away from an exit. So I'm curious, what should they be doing now to prepare for that, to like lay the groundwork?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's really kind of, taking a step back and kind of, as I mentioned above, like, all right, like what am I good at? What are, where are my gaps? But then also too, like, what do I like doing versus what I don't like doing?
Hmm.
And really, it's easy to do that in kind of a vacuum, but when you have, a trusted advisor like, our firm kind of in the door, when you're saying, maybe it's even, 1 to 2 to 3 years out or even 5 years. Like, hey, I want to grow to X, and here's what we want to do because this is what I feel like, number one, what my goals were, what I'm comfortable with my family, and we'll take on that engagement because then we can basically help prep and work with, you and your team to make all the different changes and investments and decisions in the business. I mean, just think of us as like a strategic advisory board or a board of directors, kind of coming to the table that you have somebody to say, hey, should I do this? Should I not do this?
Yeah, and
Does
that's
this
really
make sense? Does
helpful.
that make sense? I'm struggling on marketing, right? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
who do I bring in? Well, I work, these are our clients. Like we know what's good and we know what private equity and all these other investors are, and we know the playbooks, and we can kind of take that and then implement that in your business
Yeah,
to,
it's,
to get to get the
Anthony
business
and
where
I
you need to go.
wanted to kind of lay that groundwork, in the first few episodes of Contractors Edge of like just listening or teaching our listeners more about the KPIs that they need to be, setting within their business and, managing and then obviously optimizing towards. And it's
Yeah.
almost, and I wouldn't have known without, having the dealings, with you, with Basement Doctor and Nash's transition in understanding, wow, this is actually something that a business should be looking at sooner than later, unless the business owner has someone, that they're turning
Like a
this business
legacy.
over to. And there
Yeah.
wasn't a
Correct.
legacy plan in our situation. So, it obviously made the most sense to find the best partners. So
Yep.
for our owners that, are really hands-on, like how do they step back to build a leadership team that the buyers will actually value?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because this kind of dovetails into some of the questions earlier on about like what are these buyers looking for and what does kind of good look like? Well, I think the first thing is number one. I mean, they're making an investment, especially to your listener base. There may be some out there, but they're not making widgets, right? People are their business, right? I mean, you can't do an HVAC change out without a good senior tech and a good junior tech. You can't do a sewer line, kind of, basically dig a sewer line without, knowledgeable people that have been trained and taught the right way to do things, right? So the way that we kind of think about it is like culture is key. And that's what basically drives kind of the most value because at the end of the day, the investor that's coming in and the people that are going to be looking to buy your business, they're paying, they're paying dollars, right? And the last thing they want to do is have to come in and pay more dollars and invest and build some of the stuff that they didn't, because that's going to, affect the transaction value. So
Hmm.
having a culture that where everyone is empowered and there's decision making and, it's a bottoms up, top down type of a culture is really what drives, and we'll get into this, but that really drives, the kind of that multiple that everybody likes to talk about, in terms of buzzwords. But it's culture is key, and if you can show that and it presents well and it's real, I mean, that's what they want.
No, that's awesome. And for our listeners, I'm just going to kind of plant this seed for our buddies Will and Terry over at the Beers with Contractors.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of listening to the episode when you were on with Will and
Hmm.
Terry. They asked some great questions, and in that, you had said that private equity typically looks at like a 500K in EBITDA. If someone's
Yep.
not there yet, like what changes do they need to make that to move that needle the most?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, plain and simple, it's kind of like we talked about this before. It's like, what do I want to be when I grow up? I mean, is this something where, I just like my independence and I like doing work, helping people, not, having to rely on other individuals to execute? You know, that's, hey, that's a personal preference. When it comes to actually like, we get calls like that all the time. I mean, it's just hard to really, say, hey, this really isn't a business. It's really, it's really a lifestyle business, right? And so that's kind of the cutoff point. And once you kind of get to that kind of $500,000 of EBITDA, now there's kind of what I would call some meat on the bone that says, hey, there's a business here. It's sustainable and we can come in and grow it. And so in order to kind of get to that, I would say just it's really simple, and everybody's kind of tossed around like the term like SWOT analysis,
Yeah.
strengths,
Hmm.
weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And just doing a quick little 4 box and be like, all right, my next biggest, some of my peers in my market, like what are they doing?
Hmm.
And a lot of business owners, I think, are just trying to say, hey, they're my competitor. And I'm trying to, but there's a lot of these business owners that would be more than happy to like take that phone call and be like, hey, I saw you went from here to here. What's your secret? A lot of time it's just, hey, let's reach out and talk one-on-one. Like, what are you doing? How did you do this? Like, and kind of basically getting that advice of people that have, grown and scaled their businesses so that you can learn and implement some of that stuff in your business.
Well, that's
Oh,
great insight and information.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love those. situations where you kind of do surround yourself with other people who have knowledge of what you are, what your focus currently is. I always tell Mike, like we do conferences and, we try to get out and do educational stuff. And like just myself, when I'm surrounded by all the contractors or, all the marketing agencies,
Yeah.
it's inspiring. Like you get a little bit more energy, you love your job a little bit more. You're always walking away with some kind of energy. So I always do encourage those environments. Find a good network. Talk to
Yeah.
the good contractors around your area.
Yes.
You don't have to become best buddies with your biggest competitor, but there are other people that you can look for things that you like or emulate to continue to make improvements on your business. I always
Yeah.
encourage that.
Well,
Um,
and no, that's a good point. And kind of just a little bit, more to add to your comments is like obviously, we all know like within this, there's a lot of these, the next star groups and a lot of these kind of
mhm.
like, paid trade organizations that will come in to do this. But, with information and AI and like all this stuff coming out, like there's a lot of stuff on YouTube on, you know,
There's resources
how do I grow my
everywhere in
resources
2025.
are everywhere. There's too many resources, right? And so like taking that in, and the other thing I would encourage the owners to do is not just like look at the contractor, but like, hey, maybe they've got a buddy that they know like that runs a manufacturing company or,
Yes.
a distribution company. And, one of the things that we do is we do transactions, across all different industries
Hmm.
and they all have their specific nuances and stuff, but there's things you can learn in every single business that you can basically take to another business. And that's something that by just understanding how people are evaluating and running their business, maybe in a different industry, there's stuff that you can take from that conversation and apply it to your business to really kind of build and help you kind of get past that cusp of $1 million of sales or as you start to build out your
Hmm.
team.
Absolutely. So the next thing I want to go into is, one of my favorite topics, obviously,
Yeah.
uh, for listeners. It's brand, legacy, and identity. So, like to me, brand and identity, and then you said it a little bit earlier, culture. These are the things that make businesses kind of stand out, and that's for the customer, but also for somebody who would be looking to, step in and invest or become part of that vision or journey. So
Yeah.
when we're talking about home service companies, a lot of times the identity is tied directly to the owner of that company. How can
Yeah.
that be transitioned without losing value?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And Mike, I don't know, real quick question. I mean, was it J&D? Maybe
Yeah.
the full legal name of the basement doctor.
A&D
J&D was a home.
Hydrotech. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it was so many evolutions, but I think the
yeah,
the final acquisition was either J&D Basement Systems or you guys acquired the J&D Home Improvement.
Improvement.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
yeah. I mean, so right, and I had this conversation with Ron, and he's like, as he started to get in and get his feet wet, and this goes back, 20, 30 years ago. J&D doesn't really mean anything. And if you pick up the, Google, you guys work in it, right? Like how many, like, and we run multiple lists and try to, consolidate all this data and we see, it's J&D, J&D, A&A and, all these different things. And really, while that has value to the owner, it really doesn't mean anything to the customer and or to somebody that wants to acquire the business, right?
Yeah.
And so really kind of taking a step back and saying, all right, what are people investing in, whether it be, the trust from a customer or somebody that wanting to buy the business. And I think that was kind of the genesis for Ron. He's like, I want to be like front and center in everybody's mind when they're
Mhm.
thinking about repairing their basement. And, where do they go when you're sick, right? You go to the doctor. So it's not rocket science. He put basement doctor together and boom, put his resources and effort around this. And this was all before the digital age, right? And so
Mhm.
he was
Right.
doing, spots on TV and radio ads, and that's what kind of culminated the value and the trust with the customer and the consumer, and really, really built something special.
Yeah, the other part of my question though, for those who did a good job of kind of like building themselves into the branding, into the identity, but they still do want that exit plan and they
Yeah,
want investors to still see value in the business itself, right? But they are kind of on the podium or they're the face of the company. What's a good way to to kind of change the direction, but not lose the value that's built on that identity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because, a lot of, some of the questions maybe it's even kind of coming up is like, how do I, sell my business and exit and what time frame does that look like? Well, if you're doing, the commercials, the trade shows, the radio station ads, and, you have your picture on the website and you're doing all the YouTube videos, well, that's your business, like you're tied in. And so what you need to do is kind of take a step back and have a conversation with a trusted advisor, whether it be like you guys or somebody like us saying, all right, well, how do we, want to, kind of pivot and make this something that's sustainable beyond, you. And, again, kind of pointing back to what Ron did, right? Like, Mike, you talk about this. I mean, there was like a 3 or 4 year period where it was Ron on the face of everything. I mean, I just remember going out in town with him. He takes his hat off, you can't recognize him, but as soon as he
That is
has his
correct.
hat on, I mean, he's the basement doctor and everybody recognizes him. And so, there was some sort of a transition that needed to be done.
Yeah.
And maybe even too, Mike, I don't know, just a few minutes if you want to talk through that. I don't know if it came up in your last podcast, but that might be,
No, it didn't.
something of interest is like, hey, there was a strategic direction to,
Yes.
kind of transition for the business after Ron.
Yeah, and it
Mhm.
was really well thought out. It's interesting because I mean, I can go in the Wayback Machine back in 2013, the first time Ron and I sat down, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm building this brand. This is everything I want to do. These are my visions and my goals." And I'm like, "Oh, that's great, Ron. I mean, but what's your legacy plan?" And he's like, "Well, it's interesting. Really good question." And we kind of like talked about it, and he didn't necessarily have one. So when we knew that it was kind of getting to this point where I think he wanted to go and enjoy his life, and they had got a place down in Florida and we're really excited about that. And so I went back to the team and I'm like, all right, we've got to come up with some ideas here. So we started working with our animation expert and literally mapped out Ron's face and made a few different versions. We had a little dumpy version that kind of looked like a Super Mario Brother kind of guy, and then we evolved it into what it is present day. But we started trying to have like a little bit of Ron on screen, but less than normal. And he didn't really carry the whole thing because we actually took his audio, and this is before AI became like right in your face what it is now. But we took all these years of commercials that he had done and made it so that we could change the words, and we created the audio files. He didn't have to
Yeah.
do it anymore, which was exciting for us. And then we animated the little Ron figure and just started calling it the Basement Doctor. And we kind of stopped referring to it as
Do it
Ron.
as Ron.
And this was like kind of the transition. We started putting that icon in about everything. And then we started leaning into the hometown brand and we created a new seal. And, with that seal and the hometown brand, we really started relying on more of the team members. We started
Yeah.
having different experts, from their project management or their installation crews, start to do some spots with the news.
Yep.
And, we were doing more community involvement. And we actually got to a point where, I mean, Ron wasn't even there. And,
Yeah.
it was, but it took a lot of planning. So, Christian, I'm sure
Yeah.
that comes up with your clients, listeners. I'm sure that you're thinking about it because if your name is a part of your brand, the brand is key. So there is some thought that has to go into this transition. And if you don't
And
necessarily have a brand right now, I'm sure Christian will talk about it, but that is part of the value. So
yes,
establishing that brand so that people remember you and it establishes that value, that is such an important aspect.
one
Yeah. Well,
thing, one,
oh,
or go ahead, Christian.
yeah, I was just going to say too, just to kind of add on that, and it's like, hey, if I'm all about, me, how does that make my team members feel? Kind of going back to culture, and then the other thing too is like, if I want to sell this business, and say, hey, if it's got my name in it, and I want to go away, like, if you don't do it like and start planning for that on your own,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
your owner's, the new owner or the new partner is going to do it, and again, everything that they have to do is comes out of your pocket one way or the other,
Yeah.
right? In that whole multiple, right? Because that really is the output.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So
and the only thing I was going to point out for the audience is like when looking at that basement doctor story, is that it was a gradual transition. Gradual transition is something that you have to plan out. So if you are considering being able to, sell your business, and you are the face of your business, part of that plan needs to come beforehand. And how can you, gradually pull the brand a little bit away from you as the identity, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not something that can be done in a day.
Right.
So that needs to come first.
Well, and when we live in Ohio, and obviously we've got a big game coming up tomorrow,
Hmm.
against, Texas.
We're gonna win.
And you would not you would be amazed, right? Like a lot of our, clients or prospects or individuals that we talk with, they're like, hey, you know, I want to be, I want to start growing into other states and opening up markets and this. And then, at the end of the day, it's like Buckeye contracting, right? Like
Yep.
good luck setting up that business in Michigan, right?
Yeah, now
Or
you
down in
just stuck
Texas.
yourself. Yeah,
Talk
That
about
type
that
of stuff.
all
And
the time.
and 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 you guys see that all the time, right?
we do.
Like you got to have, something that's creative and grabs people's attention, again, based on your goals and objectives and what you're wanting to do. And all this comes from having conversations with people that do this stuff for a living and know how to do this.
So just to round out the conversation around the brand, and we're using Basement Doctor as the example, right? It's a really good, strong brand. And since you were part of that sale, how much value do you think the brand brought to those negotiations?
Yeah, I would say, I think it was pretty critical. At least, from an initial, and again, I don't know if we hit on this earlier, but platform versus add-on transaction. And when we brought Ron's business to market, there were really two of the only, I would say, there was one or two maybe private equity groups, backed it groups in the space, one being Groundworks, and then obviously everybody knows about basement systems, right? And so,
Right.
you had those two groups, and then you had a whole rush of, interest and investment kind of pouring into home services. And so people and, investors were out there scouring, saying, all right, well, you know, what's how do we get into this space? And we were kind of fielding those calls and learning about that as we were, kind of developing the materials. And then when we kind of came to market, obviously, Basement Doctor is really, resonating in Ohio. But, what happens, when this brand, or the new investors or the new partner wants to go down into another location that's more crawl spaces where they don't have basements. So yeah, it had a good like local kind of, I would say, more of a regional type of a strategic fit. Going down to market in, like I said, Alabama or Tennessee or Atlanta as Basement Doctor, doesn't really resonate. So that's where, a lot of the, when they're building these platforms, and Groundworks is the perfect example, right? Because that was, a lot of the basement systems dealers, Terry's Basement Systems, right? Like,
Yes.
they're in every single area of the country
Hmm.
with the person's name in it. And then obviously, a couple of these businesses were put together, some of the bigger ones that were more sophisticated and wanted to grow. And
Hmm.
then, rebranded as Groundworks. And now, it's doing over $1 billion of revenue and in every single major market across the country, right? So,
Hmm.
um, that's kind of the story. Like just as another example too, like one of their businesses, which is a competitor to Basement Doctor, is Ohio Basement Authority. Kind of
Right.
same thing, but that now has gone through, and you can kind of see it in the trucks, right? It was Ohio Basement Authority, and then underneath it was a Groundworks company, and
Hmm.
over time, as they continue to fade away from Basement Authority, it's just going to be Groundworks.
Yep. Yeah, it's really interesting how those transitions happen too.
Yeah,
So, well, I'm interested because I know our listeners are going to want to know about this,
yeah,
and this is kind of where the private equity thing kind of leans towards more of a negative presence when you're just having a general conversation. I mean, we've all been at these conferences and everything else, and people are swapping stories about, what they heard and what they may have experienced or a friend experienced. So, we've
Hmm.
seen deals go bad, essentially because the buyer just didn't understand the home service industry. How do owners choose the right buyer?
yeah. Well, and I think this is like super critical. Just because there's so much capital out there, and what that's allowing, firms to do is, in addition to buying businesses that are kind of represented by an intermediary, I will say a broker, investment banker, et cetera. They hire these firms that are going out and calling on companies, left, right, and center every single day, to try and get that phone conversation. Hey, I've got a buyer that wants to buy your business.
Mhm.
Okay, well, there's a lot of those guys out there. So how do you kind of sift through all that? And I think just kind of given, and again, not to be super self-promoting here, but like having an advisor that knows the space, has done deals with these guys, has been through the trenches, because in a deal negotiations, not just with one, but with multiple groups, like you're going to learn a lot about the personalities and the teams and how, those results have panned out. And so, having somebody that's the matchmaker and whittling that down so that, you're meeting all of your and checking all your boxes as a business owner, it's super, super critical. And the earlier you could do that, the better out the results are going to be because you're going to find that right partner. And that's going to be a deal where I'm happy as an owner and the buyer's happy as the partner,
Yeah. No, I
right?
mean,
On
it's
a go
mission
forward
critical.
basis.
Yeah,
Yep.
mission critical. It's funny because when just in talking to Ron in the last episode of the Contractors Edge, he was sharing with us that his whole intent was to sell and exit, just be
Yep.
done. Now we have another at this time former client that did sell to private equity and elected to stay to partner with them, and now there's not all on the same page. So how does a contractor decide between selling outright or, do they stay on and partner with private equity?
Yeah, and I really think it just kind of depends on, you as an individual and kind of meeting, what your personal goals are. If it's, basically wanting to be done and wanting to exit, well, there's a lot of work and a lot of steps that need to be taken. We've kind of talked about up and we'll probably talk about a little bit more, but like, building that so it is basically, here are the keys, take it over, and the business is self-automated and runs by itself, right? You've empowered the management team, you trust
Hmm.
them, they're aligned with your interests. They're aligned with the new owner's interests. Like making sure that like from a financial and economic perspective, everybody's interests are aligned and everybody's kind of rowing in the same direction on the boat, right? And if it's something where, hey, and I have a business in market right now. It's a union-based electrical contractor. The owner's 55 years old. He, went to the union right out of high school. He's a really good electrician. He's a very good people person. He's built his business up to $10 million worth of revenue
Right.
and he's now like saying, hey, you know what? I'm 55 years old. I'm at a point where I feel I'm best at basically going out and, I've got all these contacts, all these relationships, just stuff comes in. I don't even have to make a phone call to get work.
Wow.
I need to turn the keys over to somebody that knows how to operate the back office. Get rid. He's like, I don't want to sign checks. I don't want to bid insurance. I don't want to have to deal with people and HR. And at the end of the day, like I want to see this business grow, but I can take a step back in the mirror and be like, hey, I realize that I'm not the guy that's going to basically be able to grow because I like being an electrician. I like talking shop. I like,
Yeah.
hauling in business, like that type of mindset. And so from our perspective, that's a perfect scenario because, a lot of the questions are, first one is like, how long does the owner want to stay on? What does he want to do? That's the first question we get on every single outreach, that comes through. And
That's
so
smart.
having that kind of built and put that in place, really, lends itself to the story. And like everything has a story and this, Mike, to your point, kind of, it's like getting in early. We signed this client up in 2022
Hmm. So you
and
had time.
we just went to market because he's like, I want to sell. And we're like, well,
Yeah.
you sell, here's what's going to be left after taxes. Now,
Yep.
what else is going on in the business? And, over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, we've helped him basically, guided him through the process of like, hey, go out and build the pipeline and like start doing different things and diversifying the business to get into a spot where now we've got 3 years of really good financials. We've got his story straight, and now somebody can come in and basically say, hey, we're ready to, take this thing to the next level. And it's a super, and it's great.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I understand that
Yeah,
timeline. It'd be more difficult if it was something that was like, bam, the change is instant
yeah,
versus, okay, I've got this advisor and the advisor's, helping me to prepare everything and get everything in line. And that's really what we want to educate our listeners for because it's not like you're going to own the business forever. You're at some point
yeah,
going to exit. But I'm going to tell you, Anthony and I, we laugh all the time, and I love our clients and the business owners because I love their passion. I love what drives them. They're always working to grow and improve operations. But after the sale, if how much control do they really keep, and like what surprises are they in store for?
yeah. No, that's a great question. And I think the biggest one is, that I would say is number one, pace. So, like kind of going back to the earlier comment is, a lot of the private equity investors, I mean, they've got, a 3 to 5 year kind of time horizon uh, to basically make a return on their investment.
Mhm.
And, year 1 to 3 is like, we gotta like get invest in technology, people, process, systems, like all these different things, right? Along with like, all right, we want to go out and do M&A and add some, the right acquisitions and find the right deals to do to build the business to get to a point where we can deliver the return that we've, kind of the bar, if you will, to our investor base. And so, that I think are kind of critical in terms of, that type of mindset and that type of thinking.
I like
One
that.
thing, like here at Contractors Edge, that's kind of turned into a mantra is measurement, right? So even when we're talking in this space, especially when we're talking in this space about bringing on investors or outright selling your business, what you're measuring and what KPIs that you should be tracking and optimizing uh, uh, are just as important, if not more important, right? So can you
Yep.
explain for the lay people like myself, you guys have used some terms that I'm not super familiar with yet. Can you talk to me about multiples? And then can you talk to me
Yep.
about country club multiples in plain terms for our audience?
Yeah, no, I'll try to break this down. And this is obviously like one of my favorite questions, but you know, typically like in our world, and it's funny because, my wife had to buy me a shirt and I've got hats and because, when my kids come home and my wife's a teacher, she teaches third grade, God bless her soul. She's great at it, but all they hear me talking on the phone is EBITDA. And, essentially what EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and kind of in lay terms, that's like how much business does the business generate on a cash flow basis? And that's, stripping out for taxes, for, other kind of one-time items, any sort of personal expenses running through the business, basically on a normalized operating level and what a new buyer can kind of step into, what does that look like? And so that is EBITDA. And so that is a calculated measure of the financial statements. Now, the multiple that we talk about is one of those things where, that's the output. And basically, that's the purchase price divided by EBITDA. And that has varying, all different factors embedded in it. And, when I refer to country club multiple, it's like, hey, John's AC down the street got a 4 times multiple. Well, my name, why did he get a 4? And, Jim, my buddy, he runs a manufacturing distribution business. I mean, he got a 6 times multiple, right? Like there's so many different factors that kind of play in, but a lot of them are, the KPIs and the management and the systems and the culture and the employees and all those things factor into multiples. And I know like when we're doing deals, and we see, obviously, like there's a lot of peers and a lot of different businesses are marketed different ways and people have different styles. However, our style is like, hey, EBITDA, what we calculate as EBITDA on the sell side as your representative,
Hmm?
should be really aligned, in alignment and you get an agreement with a buyer. And a lot of times in order to manage that throughout a process, if the business is big enough, we'll hire a accounting firm, which is a third party, go out and hire a quality of earnings analysis. And so
Mm.
essentially what that does is basically they go through, they're a third party, they do all the financial analysis. And this is what really, was, kind of you know, when we go back to the basement doctor, like that was one of the first recommendations that we did is like, we got to sit in and we got to get the right firm in here that's going to, do the all analysis and put all that together. Because even too, like our team can do that. However, we're still seen as kind of we're still really connected to the seller, right? And so
Right.
there's a little bit of like, all right, what are they doing here? What are they doing there? And then, you go back to kind of investment banker versus broker, and a broker is really going to just market it on seller discretionary earnings or, some sort of, kind of cobble together of EBITDA. And when a buyer really digs in and engages, they find stuff that's missing. And usually, EBITDA goes down, not up when you're under LOI because you've signed over all your leverage.
Mhm.
And then there's that hard conversation that's like, hey, we're offering you, the original offer on paper was 10, but we are having trouble like underwriting, to 8, right? And there's a miss there. And so making sure that like the bar is set right away and the goalposts are already in is really kind of critical to doing a transaction because it takes the financials and the discrepancies off the table. And so that you can factor in and hone in on marketing the intangibles that are going to drive value in the future, which is culture and brand and
Mhm.
responsiveness and quality and like all those things that have allowed you to grow your business to that level is what the new buyer is going to want to invest in and put more money behind to grow.
You mentioned LOI, which if I'm not mistaken, that's letter of intent.
Yep, correct.
So what's a typical time frame from letter of intent to closing on a deal?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think I maybe just kind of backing up and when we run a process, we're always looking to kind of bring in multiple parties, different flavors. Like I mentioned, there's different flavors of private equity, right? Because a lot of our owners are like, "Hey, this is something new. I hear PE. I can't stand it. I heard about it.
Mhm.
Well, and then at this, and I want to sell it to this company because I know them. I see them at trade shows. They're buddies." And they've always expressed interest. And then when we come into the process and start laying everything out and working with our client and educating him on all the different strategic alternatives out there, I would say 9 times out of 10, the buyer that the owner thinks is going to be the buyer is not necessarily the buyer. And
Interesting.
that's a process that we manage through because, we're going to get to know the buyers. We're going to understand, what their drivers are. We're going to have, an all day type of a meeting with them to get to know them and kind of the dating and the courting process and, how their proposal differs from another proposal and kind of point out those distinct differences. And ultimately it's the buyer's decision, or sorry, it's the seller's decision to say, hey, I really like these guys. Footprint, go make sure that their offer is just like these guys, the other
Yeah.
ones, because uh, and like economics ends up, as you go through the process, the number that's on paper, kind of during that LOI proposal phase, ultimately ends up not being that number because, the financial metrics we could always probably get pretty close and from an economic perspective. It's really, who do you want to, who do you sell, who do you see yourself with? Not just in 1 year, but 2 years or 3 years, down the
Mhm.
road, if, depending upon how long you want to stay along.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
So for
oh, sorry, I didn't really answer your question, but, typically, I would say if you're trying to do a transaction yourself, it's kind of like going in and giving yourself a root canal, right? Like it's going to take a lot longer. Okay. And it's you're
getting
probably not
involved.
going to get a result.
Yeah.
However, typically in most of our transactions, we're going to have the data room, we're going to have the closet, all the skeletons out of the closet, we're going to have everything, organized and efficient so that when the buyers and their attorneys and legal teams and advisors come in, I mean, everybody kind of balks at like legal fees for transactions, but if you're the private equity firm and you're using, these big time law firms, like time is money, right? And so having everything
Mhm.
organized, leads to a significant, kind of acceleration in deal dynamics. And in our industry, time kills deals. And so, we're trying to shoot for as quick as possible, assuming we can hit all those milestones. And so typically it's like 30 to 90 days. Typically it's right around 45 to 60.
Okay. Yeah. I was circling back around, so it's
Yeah.
a good thing you caught on
Okay.
that.
Yep.
So, when we're looking at larger deals, does that change the environment at all for the requirement for owners to kind of stick around? Does that add any contention around their exit?
Yeah, and it really, and I hate to use, your Ivy League or your MBA type of an answer, but it really just depends, right? And again, kind of even some of the larger businesses that we've transacted, you know, there's a lot of times where, those owners are, they'll say they're not and they're removed, but they're intimately involved in every single decision. And so, really making sure that if we're gonna, go to market and present, this business, like we need to make sure that that owner is, really removed. And we've had several situations where, you know, as part of our process, we've said, all right, like evaluating the management team and like who's number two. And, even in preparation, like 6 or 7 months before, like we will make recommendations like this person needs to be promoted to president and they're going to be the leader. And so we can get you guys out of the business if that's what you want to do. And so we're going to, hold off and, work on the materials around the edges so that we can make sure that that management transition and that leadership is in place and the buyers can get behind that. We've had several situations where that makes sense, and in those scenarios, the owners have been out in 30 days or 60 days, or type of whenever they want to move on. So a lot of that is kind of in that planning process.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to like you built this business and most of these guys, I don't know, but you're probably dealing with businesses that are maybe 10 years to
I was going to
25
guess.
years old. I'm sure you don't have something that's just a
Yeah.
few years old and then they're looking to exit unless they struck gold and
Well, and
magically everything happened because when
well,
you
and
start a
Mike, but those
business.
are the ones where, kind of goes back to the original question of like, all right, what do I want to be when I grow up, and kind of planning with the end in mind. And that's, we've had some of those scenarios where the business is fairly new, and they've just done a really good job because they've kind of built the business with that end in mind. So absolutely.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
crazy. I listened to Tommy Mello's podcast. I know you're going to his event, next week. And in one of his more recent, podcasts, he was talking with another individual, and they were just kind of, the positives and negatives on private equity. And he said, look, he didn't want to necessarily do it, but then he looked at the alternative and said, well, I'm growing this business. I know everything about it. They don't know about the business. However, they're bringing this financial backing to the table and more advisory that he wasn't, privy to, that it could help him grow and scale. And so he kind of like did the numbers game and was like, yeah, I should partner with these guys and keep growing this thing and,
Yeah.
reap the benefits. And it's pretty wild to think about how much that's
Yeah.
grown, I'm sure.
Well, there's a term for that, and it's called OPM, right? It's like other people's money. So, a lot of owners are faced with the scenario of like, hey, I'm growing, but I'm having to basically, everything that comes in, I'm reinvesting, and some people just don't get comfortable with like, hey, I live in a certain lifestyle, and I need to continue that lifestyle for family and kids, and if I dip below that, it's going to be issues, but at the end of the day, kind of the planning and what do you want to do is really important to that, and really, a lot of the owners as well are also too like, when you're a single sole proprietor, you've got a business, the banking industry, right? Commercial banking is whatever you're taking on from a debt perspective, if you do want to use debt, like that's on you, right? Like that's a
Mhm.
personal guarantee. And then when and like in Tommy's case, if he wants to take this thing to the next level, well, he'd have to go out and borrow X amount of dollars,
Yep.
and he's personally guaranteed for that. And if, he got hit by a bus, what would happen, right? So, what we kind of take a step back and say, and I had this conversation again today, is like, hey, we got to look at your personal balance sheet and start to de-risk and take some of those chips off the table. So that now becomes a safety net for you, your family, your legacy, and now you can take everything that you know and how you built this business and then partner and bring in, the expertise in finance and operations and in marketing and sales. And now you're building that type of expertise and that type of wheel and a cog, and that does a lot better than just me as the point person trying to do it all. So, and the results are fantastic. Tommy's one of them. I mean, there's, all these results throughout the trades, right? And this recent kind of wave of consolidation and roll up, the blue collar millionaires, I think they call it now, right? Like,
Yeah.
Yep.
that's how it's done, and that's the recipe.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, now to the fun part where we put you on the hot seat. Obviously, we
Yeah,
appreciate you, providing both Anthony and I with education on, private equity and all the ways that, you become the advocate, for the seller essentially. But
yeah,
in this wrap up, I'd love for you to share with our listeners, a time that you screwed something up and then what you learned from it.
yeah. No, absolutely. And I kind of was thinking about this and just kind of for the relevancy of kind of what we've talked about up above, I think I'll kind of flip the script a little bit and say, all right, tell me, from, getting in the weeds and, in your day job for the listeners out there, what were deals that, went well or didn't go well? And I kind of said, all right, well, what did some of these buyers do wrong?
Hmm.
In a transaction that we were representing our client, right? And so I think I take one example, and we had this kind of is how we really kind of got into the home services industry, is we had a small sewer drain and plumbing business up in kind of Northeast Ohio, and we were marketing the business. We had interest. It was kind of going, and this is 2020 2021.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And, COVID hadn't really hit yet, and we had just kind of gone to market. We had some interest from some of these guys that wanted to buy it and operate it, and they wanted to, buy it and find an operator to kind of put in, and they were just kind of keep it as is.
Hmm.
And then, we had an LOI, and the guy was very difficult to get back and forth with. It was hit and miss. He'd be asked for something, we'd send it to him, and he just basically kind of took his time. And going back to the analogy, time kills deals. Well, what that does, and we were really like waiting for a formal LOI at at that point in time, is that, that gives me more time as the investment banker to go out and figure out who wants to buy this thing. And so it was really interesting as I was just kind of doing some additional research, and I found a small little invest or independent sponsor group out of Chicago called North Branch Capital, that said that they were doing some stuff in and around Ohio in plumbing, heating, and drain. So I picked up the phone, had a conversation, and I said, "Hey, we're marketing, this business. Is there an interest there?" And he's like, "Let me check. Give me 30 minutes." Made the phone call, talked to the owner. Turns out that they had basically, an LOI on another business, like basically in the same geography right down the road.
Oh, wow.
And it took 30 minutes, and he said, "We'll send over an LOI." And that basically, blew everything out of water. And that was kind of in like, I think we signed the LOI on like, I'd say maybe the end of February in 2020. And then COVID happened.
Oh,
Yeah.
And so then we basically kind of did a double, we all were like, got a phone call from them, and we're like, "Oh man, there's no way this closes because of this major economic event." And he's like, "You've got, tell your client we're going to close the deal. Just we need some time to evaluate what's going on, because like they had to basically make sure like all their portfolio companies and shore up kind of the capital and make sure that they had enough operating capital to kind of weather a storm. And we all know what happened with COVID. Everybody started staying at home and using their plumbing and heating and cooling all
Yes.
throughout the day. And then boom, it went like this. And
yeah.
we ultimately got the deal done. And not only did our client do well with the North Branch guys at the same time, and within 3 months later, they were in the process of forming Heartland Home Services. They ultimately took that to market, sold that to the Jordan Company, who subsequently has done like 50 to 60 add-ons after that, and is
Wow.
now like a $500 million plus revenue, leader in kind of the Midwest on that platform. And our client ended up being, I think it was like the seventh or eighth acquisition into that platform. So,
That's
Wow.
crazy.
That
um,
is crazy.
yeah. So just kind of says like, hey, time kills deals, and having somebody like, on your side that's advocating for you and pushing the negotiations and working to find that right partner is really beneficial. So
That's
Oh,
great.
absolutely.
yeah.
No, I really like this conversation because it's very macro, it's very big picture,
Yeah.
right? So rolling into the pro tip of the week for the audience here, start thinking macro and higher level. Start running your business like it's for sale today, right? Even if you don't plan to exit for years, that means clean the books, clear your KPIs. A leadership team that can run the company without you, and a brand that stands on its own are the keys to this. All right. Buyers pay top dollar for predictability and systems, not chaos. I'll leave it
Yeah.
there.
Well said. Well,
Yeah,
Christian,
well said.
thank you so much for coming on today, breaking down obviously what's, in my opinion, incredibly intimidating. At least to myself, I've now been through this, but obviously for our listeners that are thinking about it or have been through it, once and then potentially even repeating this with another business, uh, how do people get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're one of the things that like with our business is, I will always have a conversation. And, even if you think you're too small, or, you're not valuable or, you have kind of doubts, I'm always open to a conversation. So obviously, footprintcapital.com is our website, C Olson at Footprint Capital. And then, my phone number is 614. I don't know, you'll put a banner out of it, but 614-634-1089. Love to talk shop, love to learn about, everybody's got a unique story. That's what's exciting about our business and the services that we offer is like every day we get new stories about, how great, entrepreneurship is.
Mhm.
And, it really take it, it kind of puts a humbling effect on like, hey, we've got a great country here because, it's so much easier to start and grow and operate a business here in the US than it is in anywhere else in the world. And we need to take it, we need to take a step back and say, hey, this is this is our country. This is our, we need to take pride in that because the stories that we hear from starting in a garage to, scaling
Mhm.
to a multi-hundred-million-dollar business. I mean, we hear those all the time and it's awesome.
Yeah,
So,
we share in that. We feel,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, it is so like, I don't know, it's hard to put it into words, but it is. It makes you feel good. I know our team, at the agency, they care about our, client owners essentially and what they're doing in their businesses. And we get to know their stories, through the discovery and the evolution of their brands. And then we watch them grow. And now we've seen, two exit. We know that there's a few others that are, considering it as well. It's both exciting, but also, heartbreaking for us and our position. But, it's just an exciting journey. So,
yeah,
for our listeners out there, we do have some action items for you. First and foremost, audit your financials and KPIs, know those numbers. We've been talking about it in our recent episodes. Obviously, Christians give us a laundry list of things that we need to pay attention to when you're preparing to, potentially consider the exit and pick up the phone, get an advisor. Don't go at this alone. Start documenting what your processes are and build your leadership team's depth. I saw this, obviously in the basement doctor. I think that it helped in that transition because there were key people that could carry the business when Ron exited. So, and then the third is have the conversation early. Even if you're not ready to sell right now, just at least prepare in advance so that you get the most out of this. Think about all the time and, the money that you've put into this, your hopes and your dreams. Just make sure you're getting everything out of this. And,
yeah.
I'm going to appeal to you. So if you got value out of our conversation today, just do us a favor. Like, rate, follow, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. That helps us to bring you the tips, tools, and tactics that give you the edge to grow your business. We'll see you next time on Contractors Edge.